Hello everybody, my name is Thomas Klebanoff, and today I want to share with you a plugin I began developing with JUCE over the summer. This plugin serves to address several of the workflow issues I've had while learning to produce electronic music. Before I get into how this plugin works with JUCE, I want to briefly describe my motivations for making it and show you how it works in action. So I found that one of the biggest challenges involved in learning to produce was signal routing and signal processing. I began learning how to produce when I was 15 or 16, mostly just through online tutorials and things. And there was a phase for about 2 or 3 years where I was, producing many tracks that just didn't stand up to professional songs I was listening to and downloading on the internet. And I couldn't figure out why. And so I tried to solve this problem by, I was cluttering my tracks, with new elements, processing sounds in these overly complex ways. It just didn't work. So at a certain point, I realized that the songs that stuck with me the most just throughout my childhood were the simplest ones. There weren't more than a few elements, but they were processed really well. The songs were all meshed and they glued really well together. So this was kind of a turning point for me because it showed me that simple melodies and sounds, those have the most sonic impact. So the question for me became how to turn a simple input into a bold and complex output, and how to make variation over the course of the song so that the listeners enjoy it. And over the past couple years, I've started realizing that the answer lies in signal routing and signal processing. So the ability to split a signal apart and process it from different angles and then weave it back together is the way in which good producers will take simple sound and make them bold and complex. So here on this graph, I've showed you kind of how a signal could be routed through a digital audio workstation. And so this first section up there might be the initial sound design phase, but then if you want to make the sound, especially if it's synthetic or electronic, if you want to make it have some sort of space, you'll send it through other plugins, so like a reverb or a delay, and you can process it further from there and get maximal control over the sound. So the best producers in the world have figured out how to do this not only in just like a static way, but have also figured out how to modulate the plugin parameters within their routing scheme in order to build energy and tension and make complexity and morph one sound into a completely different one. So at any point in this signal chain, you might want to insert another box, which does something else. So the purpose of this project was to provide a way for music producers to do all of this graphically, as opposed to a standard sends and returns that you find in most DAWs. I wanted to put together a modular routing environment in which a producer could work. So when I was learning how to produce, I would have an idea about how I wanted to split and process a signal, but wrapping my head around how to route that with sends and returns in a digital audio workstation, it would snap me out of the producing workflow. And that's one of the most important things when you're producing a song, is you want to stay focused on the groove of the beat. You don't want to have to think about something technical when you're trying to tap into that flow. And it wasn't that I couldn't figure out how to route the signal in a digital audio workstation. It was more that doing that broke my focus. So say you had a sound that you routed like this, you might want to switch something up. You realize that this routing scheme doesn't sound good, or you want to process it in a different way. But then undoing all of that, it is a pain. So say you wanted to do something like this, and instead of meshing the reverb and delay together over there, you might want to process them differently or distort the delayed signal or something like that. And so being able to switch between routing schemes is something that I didn't find accessible in most digital audio workstations. So I think that graphical routing brings the focus back to producing music, letting producers set up their routing structures when they're not in the state of flow of producing. So as I began kind of researching how to do this, I stumbled upon JUCE. So without this, I wouldn't have been able to get the plugin that I made to where it currently is, and I wouldn't feel confident that I could push it forward. So I want to show you a video about how this works and how this kind of thing works in a workflow setting, and then I'll show you how the different pieces of JUCE fit together in order to make this possible. And this plugin relies on aspects of the JUCE plugin host, especially with the graph connection. So here's a video of this working. Where's my mouse? There we go. This is, yeah, Okay, so this plugin is it's all possible with a few of the JUCE library classes, some of the functionality found in the JUCE host. So studying how the JUCE host worked was critical in my learning process as I developed this. I basically studied the source code and was able to learn from that, port it, and then extend it and add macros for kind of my own purposes. So over the next few minutes, I'll show you how this plugin works with JUCE from a coding perspective. All right, so basically the idea of this plugin is it's a graph. Obviously, it's an audio processor graph. So graphs are data structures that have nodes and connections. The audio processor graph is a graph of audio processors, and it's got an input and output. You can send MIDI in or audio into this, and then each node contains it's a pointer to an audio processor. Each node has, as you add nodes to the graph, they basically accumulate node IDs, and that's a way for you to access each node within the graph. So, for example, with the macros, if you want to access one node and change the certain parameter in it, you have to use the node ID to do this. Connections have a source node, a destination node, and then the channel indexes for each, and that could let you route, the left input or output of one node to the left or right input or output of another one. And so then there's also the input-output processors. And in this picture, that's audio in and audio out, and that's what I used in the plugin that I just showed you. You can also have that be MIDI in or MIDI out. Okay, so here's how the GUI that was found in the JUCE host lets you assemble this graph in a very visual way. So there's a couple different GUI components that let you do this. I want to talk to you about a couple of them so you have an idea about what they do. And this is the functionality that I found in the JUCE host, and this is what helped me. So first is a pin component. I don't know if that arrow is really pointing to the exact pin component, but it's that little pin right there. And that has the node ID and the channel index of the filter that corresponds with. So each pin could be a left or right channel, or like the left and right sidechain input or something like that. Or it could be an output. So it contains a Boolean to describe that also. Then there's a connector component, and that class contains functions to basically set the input or output. That's used when you're changing a connection. Has functions that figure out how to draw this wire, and it also stores a source and destination ID and channel index of that. So then there's the filter component itself, and within the graph panel, the filter component has the XY position, and it also it lets you double click on it and open up the plugin window. And so these are the things that make this work. All of these are contained within the graph editor panel, which handles plugin creation. So if you were to right click on this and select a plugin, it creates a new filter node at the XY position of your mouse, for example. And then that's what has the methods that you can use to drag the wires. Okay, so then the rest of the GUI components, there's the plugin windows themselves, which launch when you double click on the filter component. And then the ones that I added for the macro control are down here. It's a macro bar and macro slider. And the way this works, which I'll get into in a moment, is basically you have a standard library multi-map where the elements are mappings, and they're indexed by keys which represent which macro slider is in the macro bar. So here's, you already kind of saw this, but here's what that would look like in a DAW. So here's essentially the macro functionality. You have each one of these macros that has an associated mapping panel with it. This mapping panel contains mapping entries, which have one box where you select what filter in the graph you'd like to use, and another box where you select a parameter within that filter. So, for example, you could have on the left you'd have say the reverb, and on the right you'd have reverb size. And as you change the box on the left, it updates the box on the right. Then, in addition to that, you have a range, and that's because the macros go from 0 to 1. In there earlier, we were talking about how macros are normalized, but for a plugin, you might want to only have the macros sweep between a fraction of that. So what this does is it constrains that. So up here, as I mentioned, we have the macro bar, which contains and indexes macro sliders. And that contains references to the graph and the mapping manager, which holds all of this. You have macro sliders, which basically lets you open up a pop-up window, which will show you the mapping panel. And then you have mapping panel, and that was, in the video demo, that's what this was. And it lets you basically add or remove each one of these mapping entries. And this is a way to, it's like the GUI representation of what's going on behind the scenes with mappings and mapping manager. Okay. So now I already explained a little bit of this, but when you change the first combo box, it goes through and it updates the second combo box so that the two are linked. Okay, so the difference between mapping and mapping manager versus mapping panel, slider, and entry is that these are the GUI components, and those are the implementation of the mappings. As mentioned, it's a multi-map because you could have more than one mapping on each macro. So here's a bit of the code so you can have some idea of how this works. There's the mapping, like the header file for the mapping class. And I'd say the functions I want to point out are signal received functions, because this is essentially how it works. When the macro is turned, it calls it's a change, and so it will call signal received with the macro index and the value of the slider, and it'll push that through to the mapping manager, which then iterates through all of its members and finds when the macro index matches. And if it does, then it will call signal received on the mapping itself. So this is the way where you index macros and you funnel it through. And then this is, in this entire span of making this plugin, this is the only non-JUCE class I used. So then when each mapping gets the value, it has to scale it based on its upper and lower bound. And so that's what this function will do. It basically makes it so that every mapping, it only it'll turn the knob where you want it to turn, basically. Okay. So actually, so one of the things I had to figure out while developing this is how to link this into a plugin format. And so one of the things that JUCE does really well is it lets you focus on just the algorithms. And the key algorithms that make a plugin work are prepare to play, release resources, and process block. And what this is basically doing is it's just the plugin processor will have the graph, and it just sends the calls to process block through to the graph. So that's what these lines of code are doing. So if you're ever trying to use a graph in one of your plugins, that's how you can do it. All of this is done with scoped pointers, which is good because then when the objects are deleted, you don't have to worry about leaks. Okay, so that's basically how this works within the context of JUCE. There's a few features that I'm looking to add to this. And they extend it so you can make the plugin a little bit more useful. So one thing that I like to do is have it be so that you can save little clusters of modules. And that would help because if you, say you have like a one delay plugin that you want to send through to a distortion and then have some other kind of effect on it, you want to group that together and save that. You could create a block of that, and that's one of the things I'm going to look to do. One of my friends who produces music said that a nice feature would be when you're setting the high or low bounds of a mapping, if the audio snaps to the position of the mapping slider as you're holding that, so you can hear in real time the bounds. And that's a workflow thing that he thought would help speed this up. That's another thing. Another thing, I haven't figured out how to make this save and load yet, but I will. So you can easily, I know that there's JUCE classes that help to do that. So XML. I had to get the macros right before I figured that out. I think one thing that would help with this plugin is some sort of signal visualization. So you can see volumes coming in and out of nodes or frequency spectra in and out of nodes. and then adjust these things in a flexible way. And then also a way to have your graph and then freeze it so that your CPU it doesn't get taxed too much. So another thing that I'm looking to do with this is have multiple inputs and outputs to the graph. I think this would address something about drum processing. So for those of you who don't produce music, one of the ways which you can make all of these eclectic samples sound like they mesh together is by kind of grouping them and processing them in groups and then filtering them through this kind of like this tree of processing. So I'll show you what I mean. You have different percussion elements that are all samples. You might have found them in different sample libraries, sample packs, but you want them to gel and sound good in your mix. But you also don't want to just throw them all through one bus and slam a compressor on it. You want to kind of stage it. And so you group similar sounds, group sounds that are doing the same kind of task together, and you group them kind of in this way. But it's not always the same for every track. Different samples sound differently. So you may want to have a drum mix where then all of a sudden you realize that your toms go better with the kick than your snare clap does, and you want to rearrange this. And the way that it works currently in digital audio workstations, it's a headache to do this, and it takes you out of the workflow. So with this kind of plugin, if you have multiple inputs and outputs going through it, then you could just drag the wires and switch it up, and then you have something like this. I think this is all possible with JUCE, and this is another place we're looking to take this. And this kind of is a slide that should have been earlier, but this is what I mean by grouping a chunk of nodes together and then saving that as one, and then it simplifies your diagramming even more. You make it modular. Okay, so that's basically my presentation. Any questions?
Thanks very much, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks. A very interesting project. It's actually not a question, just another point you can add is A/B comparison. You have different trees and you can switch between them, which would help you with one of the things you showed in the beginning, that you would like to change a chain to another thing, and then you can compare which one is best.
Right, and I think that'd be a great addition too, because then you can assemble this routing scheme and then send your sounds through it, and then switch your routing scheme completely with just a click of a button.
Does this plugin? I assume it works on a bus channel in the DAW itself. So you could put it on a bus. So you could actually combine the DAW's routing with this. Right. Yeah, that would be really nice. And definitely get the automation of the macro knobs, because you could get some wild stuff going. I think if you do that.
If you're producing say like a house music build-up over 16 bars or something, and you want to take one sound and then translate it from here to there. Say you want to you want to sweep a filter up, you want to expand the reverb, stereo widen it, whatever you want to do, distort it, whatever, pull it all the way up and then pull it all the way back. The way you do that now is by using several different automation lanes, maybe on several different tracks. But if you use this workflow, then you can just map it all into one macro and then use that macro to sweep up and down, and then you're done. And you can save that once I figure out how to make it safe.
Just a quick question. Was it difficult to combine the JUCE Host and the JUCE plugin together?
So that was what I had to figure out how to do first. I didn't when I had the idea for this plugin, I didn't know really what JUCE was. I didn't know anything like this. When a friend of mine recommended that I look into it because it was good at audio, and when I downloaded it, I looked at the JUCE Host. I was like, this kind of looks a little bit like what I'm looking for. And then I had to basically strip it all the way back down just to the graph functionality to understand that. And then once I did that, I realized that there were a couple key classes, and those are the ones that I went through. It's mostly the graph of filters and figuring out how to link the process block of an audio plugin into the process block of the graph. So once you have the graph, it's actually really straightforward to do. But having to figure out how to change it from a desktop application to a plugin, that was where a lot of the work on this was.
Any more questions? So question. So this reminds me a lot of things like Max for Live, for example.
Right.
So is there anything that sort of you can do with this that you couldn't do with things like Max for Live, for example, where you would hit like a limitation?
I mean, Max is very flexible, and I've used it and kind of toyed around with it a little bit, but I haven't gone so deep into it that I know exactly. But I think what this is it's a lot slimmer, and so if you're producing it, there's less things to think about. So it's really about that. It's really about keeping the workflow producing going. So I think you can do this sort of thing in Max for Live, I'm sure. But it's really about providing like a small utility that speeds up your workflow.
Okay, any more questions? Well, thank you, Thomas. That's a really excellent presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.